Okay, let's picture a thoughtful, highly reflective, postgraduate TESOL student. We'll call them our mentee for today. They're sitting at their desk, staring blankly at a screen and feeling literally paralyzed by anxiety. Why? Well, they've just been tasked with designing and grading their very first midterm test. The pressure feels immense, right? They're terrified of getting it wrong, of somehow misjudging their students, and of creating this rigid tool that just punishes rather than actually supporting learning. It is a really heavy burden to carry.
But this is exactly where a knowledgeable, experienced mentor steps into our scenario. Seeing this panic, the mentor doesn't just hand over a generic template for a midterm. Nope. Instead, they step in with a Socratic question to kind of challenge those base assumptions. Is assessment just testing? To answer this, the mentor brings up Chapter 2 of a really foundational text, Assessment for Language Teaching by Professors Eek, Pucky T, and Constant Lewing. The goal here is to completely shift our anxious mentee's perspective away from the narrow, frankly scary confines of just testing.
Let's dive right into Part 1. Language assessment, rethinking the basics. And this brings us straight to the first of our 3 big takeaways for today. Assessment is a broad, continuous ecosystem. It's not just a standalone event. Ekpakatini and Constant Lung explicitly define assessment as a superordinate term. Think of it like a massive umbrella. Under this umbrella, you've got everything from those formal sit-down exams to the most casual, everyday classroom interactions. When you pause a lesson and simply ask the class, "Hey, does anyone have any questions?" Guess what? You are conducting an assessment. You're collecting real-time information to adjust your teaching right in that very moment.
To help relieve some of that anxiety, the mentor draws a really sharp contrast between testing and assessment. Testing is a much narrower concept. It usually involves standardized procedures, controlled time limits, and strict invigilated environments. It's pretty rigid. Assessment, on the other hand, is about broader evidence gathering. It includes informal observations, project-based tasks, and portfolios. So the mentor tells the mentee, look, you're actually assessing your students every single day through observation. The midterm is really just one tiny specific slice of that.
This whole concept brilliantly illustrates a core alignment we absolutely have to maintain. Whether you're using a strict formal test or a highly flexible informal assessment, both of those things must ultimately align with the overarching learning goals and performance standards of your syllabus. So our mentee realizes that the midterm doesn't have to be a trap. It just has to measure the exact same learning goals they've been teaching towards all semester long.
Moving on to Part 2, Formative versus Summative Types of Assessment.
As our mentee starts to realize that their daily classroom warm-up is actually an assessment, the mentor zooms out to categorize these practices. The absolute critical point here is understanding the difference between 2 massive categories. Formative assessment, or FA, is assessment for learning. It provides ongoing feedback designed specifically to improve learning while it is still happening. Summative assessment, or SA, is assessment of learning. It gives a final mark, grade, or score without that corrective feedback loop. It essentially looks back at what was achieved at the very end of a given period. Connecting this theory back to real classroom practice, the mentor points out just how much formative assessment the mentee is already doing entirely naturally. Informal questions, having students peer assess each other, embedded exercises, that is all formative. The dreaded midterm, well, that is simply summative. It's an achievement test. Seeing it categorized like this really helps demystify the midterm. It's not a monster, it's just a summative tool in a much larger toolkit. Next up is Part 3, Power and Consequences, the Impact of Assessment. This brings us to our second big takeaway, the immense social and educational power of assessment. Eek, Patini, and Constant Lung hit the nail on the head when they say, all assessment activities have power and consequences. Even an informal, seemingly low-stakes classroom quiz holds power. Why? Because it tells a student something fundamental about their ability. It directly shapes their motivation. It can either foster incredible confidence or induce deep, deep anxiety. The mentor uses this to validate the mentee's initial panic. You know, you are totally right to take the midterm seriously because assessment does have power, but let's learn how to use that power responsibly. And this concept of power scales all the way up to a macro, systemic level as well. We so often see large-scale, high-stakes standardized tests deployed by governments or educational agencies to enforce national curriculums. As the authors note later in the chapter, this can totally overshadow teacher-based assessment. Honestly, it often stems from a perceived lack of trust in classroom teachers by external agencies.
Understanding this power dynamic really helps language teachers see exactly why advocating for balanced, localized classroom assessment is so incredibly crucial for their students. Now for part 4, 6 purposes. Why we assess.
Our third big takeaway focuses heavily on the purpose behind what we do. If you really want to use the power of assessment ethically and effectively, you absolutely must align it with your goals. The authors outline 6 major purposes. First up, the formative function, to guide and support ongoing learning. Second, the summative function, to measure achievement at the end of a learning period, which, as we know, is exactly what our mentee's midterm is doing. But look at the third, the diagnostic function. This is all about identifying readiness, strengths, and weaknesses. The mentor explains that by using diagnostic tasks, like having students detect errors in a text early in the semester, you can plan future support long before that summative midterm ever happens.
This builds perfectly into the broader institutional functions of assessment. The fourth purpose is placement, assigning students to the appropriate course level. The fifth is gatekeeping, admitting or selecting applicants into academic or professional programs. And the sixth is proficiency, certifying overall language ability, often for external reasons like immigration or university entrance, using tests like TOEFL or IELTS. Recognizing these different purposes helps our mentee realize something huge. They don't have to accomplish all 6 of these with one single midterm test. Their midterm has a very specific, limited job.
Which brings us to our final section, part 5, teacher takeaways, applying the concepts.
So, where does this leave our initially very anxious TESOL student? Well, their anxiety is largely relieved. They now see testing as just one small tool in a vast pedagogical toolbox. By focusing on the specific purpose of the midterm, summative achievement, they can design it with total clarity and confidence, knowing it's already backed up by weeks of formative assessment. And this beautifully illustrates the core concept of this entire chapter, developing language assessment literacy, or LAL. When considering the prompt, is language assessment necessary for language teaching and learning? The answer is a massive, resounding yes. It requires teachers to understand these principles so they can empower their students, make informed pedagogical decisions, and basically not be intimidated by the very concept of testing. So let's explicitly reinforce those 3 big takeaways from EP3 and Constant Long's work that we've explored today. Number 1, assessment is a broad, continuous ecosystem that includes everyday classroom interactions, not just formal tests. Number 2, assessment carries immense social and educational power, acting as a gatekeeper and directly shaping learner confidence, which is exactly why we have to use it thoughtfully. And number 3, assessment serves multiple, distinct purposes, from diagnostic to summative, that must be strategically aligned with your overarching teaching goals. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. I want to leave both our mentee in the scenario and all of you listening with a final provocative thought. Now that you see assessment not as this singular, anxiety-inducing event, but as a diverse, highly powerful ecosystem driven by very specific purposes, how will this new assessment literacy change your classroom practice tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating source material. Keep reflecting and keep learning.